actually on their side, that they can look to it for their salvation. When they do that, they're looking to a false god. They've been deceived and allowed themselves to be deceived, sometimes almost willfully, thinking, if only I can get my man into power, then all will be well. But somehow it never is. Somehow, when anyone gets into power, he becomes corrupted by that power. Those are the kinds of dangers I'm talking about, the kinds of dangers my work relates to.
Dallas, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Dr. Hedges, in your view, you said government is dangerous or to be denounced. I would like to ask you if, in your vast knowledge, if you see any role for government, if you do, can you give 3 examples? Or would you admit to 3 roles that government plays?
I can imagine government playing a defensible role. And when we talk about theories of government in economics and political science, we talk about using government as a means basically to more effectively protect the rights of individuals, to protect their lives, their liberties, their property. This is the justification for government that goes all the way back to Locke and to some extent even before Locke. So we can imagine that government would be a useful institution. However, when we study history, what we find is that limited government is extremely rare and short-lived. That when we have government, it begins, if it begins small, its natural tendency is, as Jefferson said, to gain ground. And the natural tendency, he also said, is for liberty to lose. That's what we've seen in this country. We had a fairly limited government at the beginning of the United States, especially a limited federal government. Government was more powerful at the state level. But even there, some of the state government powers were sloughed off over the next 50 or 60 years. So that by the time we got up into the 1840s and 50s in this country, we had something that approximated limited government about as well as any government of a major country ever did. But it didn't last. And I think we could have seen, if we'd been honest analysts at that time, that there were forces working to break it down, to cause government to grow bigger, more powerful. And in that case, the first thing that happened was the war between the states, in which case governments on both sides of the war grew extremely powerful for prosecution of the war. And because of what the Union government had done during the war, lasting precedents were created, or in some cases, lasting institutions were created during the war that saddled the people ever afterwards. Government used its power to give privileges to railroad builders. It used its power to enrich those who had cozy connections with the government in power. And it built from there. Every time there's a war, we have another move upward on what I call the ratchet of the growth of government. Government gains power during national emergencies. When the emergency passes, some of those powers are surrendered, but not all. So that in each crisis, the government becomes bigger than it otherwise would have been. And the lesson here is that however effective, however useful, however valuable we may think government might be conceptually, actual government never works that way for very long. And the reason is because government power, if it exists at all, attracts people to seize it and use it for their own purposes. Sometimes their purposes are ideological. Sometimes their purposes are perfectly venal and materialistic. Sometimes their purposes are perfectly noble. They want to help their fellow man and uplift the downtrodden. But one writer spoke of the humanitarian with the guillotine. And that's an image we would do well to recall, because the government, the agency that controls the guillotine, can be turned to any purpose. And because of the powers it uniquely possesses, it poses a unique danger to everyone. So I would simply caution again, we should apply the precautionary principle. When we turn to government, we're seizing a very dangerous instrument. We may think it's in our control. We may think that it's in the hands of good and noble people. But that doesn't ensure it will stay there, and it doesn't ensure that it will continue to be used for the purposes we approve.
Robert Higgs was born in Oklahoma in 1944. Why Oklahoma? Why were you there?
Well, my family on my father's side had been in Oklahoma for several generations. My grandmother, my father's mother, came into Oklahoma in one of the land rushes when she was a very small child. So we went back quite a long time on his side. My mother had come to Oklahoma as an infant when she was very young, and her family had lived elsewhere in the north in Michigan, but we didn't stay in Oklahoma very long. My family moved when I was 7 years old to California, and I grew up there.
In 1950-ish, or
1951, we moved.
Why did you move?
Well, we moved because economic opportunity was more attractive. Wages were higher in California, and my father, who was a very hardworking man, was not earning nearly as much in Oklahoma as he hoped to earn in California, and indeed that's how it turned out.
What kind of work did he do?
Well, he did a lot of different work. He worked in the oil fields as a derrick man for some years. He had worked in farming early in his life. His family operated a family farm in Oklahoma. So from a very early age, he did farm work, and he knew a lot about farming. And later on, after we moved to California, he worked mostly in farming and eventually became one of the managers of a big corporate farm in Central California.
Now, you currently live in Louisiana. Why?
Yes. Well, I live there because my wife is a Louisiana native, and she wants to live in Louisiana. She has a lot of family there, and so I'm there.
And what do you do there?
Well, I do all the things that I do anywhere, which is to write. I work with the Independent Institute as the editor of the Independent Review, which is a scholarly quarterly. And that occupies much of my time. But I also work in other ways. I mentioned earlier I work as a consultant from time to time. I've worked with law firms as a consultant and with trade associations and with governments, actually. I worked with the Washington State government back in the 70s in a fisheries consulting capacity. And I've done that kind of work later, not in Washington, but in fisheries work related to Alaska. But I now write, lecture for anybody who makes me an attractive offer. So I'm available as time permits to do work that interests me and helps me make a living.
Robert Higgs is our guest on In Depth, Buffalo, New York.
Hi, Dr. Higgs. I wanted to start out by giving you a personal thanks for an introduction to Austrian economics. The talk you gave on C-SPAN on Book TV a few years ago for Against Leviathan completely changed my life, and I found that it has allayed a lot of, you spoke to fear earlier, it's allayed a lot of my fear. I've since tried to pass that forward and have turned a few people onto the ideas. But I'm wondering, what have you found, say, in passing conversation when you have 2 minutes or less with someone that might not have the attention span to read Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State? What have you found is effective in sort of turning people on without being confrontational? And I'd also like to give